Hello viewers, and welcome yet again to another episode of Dinner Guide. I am your host Chef Andy, and today I'm happy to mention that we're going to be making some homemade ravioli. Now I of course will be using some wonton sheets in place of pasta dough, a very good alternative that can actually work two ways. I'm also going to be incorporating some very beautiful ingredients, but before I begin our very simple spinach stuffed ravioli with our coconut cream sauce, I'm going to begin by introducing the ingredients that we'll be working with, and then we'll proceed into the main event. Now from the very front, you'll require about 20 sheets of wonton paper. You'll also require one whole egg, some fresh thyme, some ginger powder, some coriander powder, one whole imported lemon or local lemon. You'll also require about 1 teaspoon of some chopped chives. You also require some flour for dusting, some fresh coriander, about 2 tomatoes seeded and diced. You'll also require some white onion chopped up, one for your sauce and of course the other for your spinach. You'll also require some salt for seasoning and some coconut milk, which we'll be incorporating into our sauce. You'll also require a nice big bunch of some finely chopped up fresh spinach, some oil to cook with, and last but not least, some peppercorns to crush. But before we begin, we'll give you this chance to sit back, relax and unwind, and we'll catch you after a short break. So be sure to have quite an abundance of filling to make sure that you don't actually run out when you begin to assemble your ravioli. And using your sharp knife, proceed to chop that as finely as you possibly can. Remember, the sharper the knife, the easier the process. Hello viewers, and welcome back. Now to begin our very simple process, I will of course begin by recapping on what you missed out if you're just tuning in. We've pretty much begun by introducing the ingredients that we'll be working with. We're going to be making a very simple spinach stuffed ravioli, and I'm going to be pairing that with a very simple coconut sauce to go with. Now to begin your process, very important that you take time to have your filling done in advance. So we're going to be starting with just that. So I'll begin the process by heating up a pan, and to that we're going to begin to cook our filling, which is of course our spinach. Very important that I mention, also have a pot of water ready. Now this we're going to be cooking our ravioli in a little later, so I'm just going to leave that undisturbed at the end. Now very important that you begin with the filling, because this needs a bit of time to cook and to cool off before you incorporate it into your dough. Very important that I mention at this stage that you should always make sure to do your filling a little time in advance. This will of course enable you in making sure that your filling is cooled off way in advance before you begin assembling your ravioli, and this will of course make it much easier for you to jump straight onto making your coconut curry sauce before you complete the process and begin to plate. Now to start off the process, I'm going to begin by sauteing a bit of some onions. Now as I mentioned, I've got 2 bunches of onions here, one that I'll be using for the sauce and the other that we'll be using for the spinach. Now into your pot or your pan, proceed to add about 2 tablespoons of oil and allow that to heat up very briefly. To that we're also going to be incorporating some fresh thyme. So also take time in removing your leaves from the stems. This will of course make it so much easier for you to work, and you don't really have to worry about taking your thyme out at the end of the process. And the thyme as well will also incorporate a very beautiful nuttiness and flavor into your spinach, making sure that your ravioli is of course very flavored right through. And being that your ravioli will of course be in a sauce, very important that you make sure that your sauce, that your filling is of course very flavorful, because of the fact that you will of course have to bite into the ravioli. And of course, very important, on many occasions most of us forget to make sure that the seasoning in your ravioli is right. So be sure that you take quite a bit of time in making sure that your filling is actually nicely flavored, so that it actually carries the flavor right through the dish. Now, to begin the process, begin by sauteing some onions. Now, I'm using white onions for this process for the fact that it's also a very beautiful combination to a ravioli filling, and it actually brings a very beautiful flavor that's not of course very overpowering, and it will also mellow down very nicely with the coconut flavors, making sure to give a nice beautiful feel in the mouth. Next, I'm also going to add to that my thyme. Now proceed to saute your onions right up until they're almost translucent in color. Right, now once your onions are sweated out, very simply proceed to add your spinach. Now be sure to also have quite enough of your filling. Remember, at most cases, some of us do tend to make a very small filling and end up with quite a bit of pasta sheets or wonton sheets remaining. So be sure to have quite an abundance of filling to make sure that you don't actually run out when you begin to assemble your ravioli. Now, as you saute this, the spinach will of course continue to wilt. Very important that you actually keep the mixture as dry as possible, for the fact that you're actually going to be using it as a filling. Make sure that it actually does not contain any fluids, that it doesn't really have any water at the end of the frying process. So I prefer to always saute in small batches. This of course enables you to be able to get the flavor carrying through the process very nicely. Also allows for you to be able to make sure that you can actually get the onions to mix through nicely with the thyme, and that you don't actually have too much at once, making it impossible for you to toss the mixture in your pan. Now continue to mix that through, cooking at a relatively moderate height, temperatures of course, and very important that you actually maintain your temperature at medium to low. This will of course aid in making sure that you also don't overcook your spinach, and that you don't also overwilt your spinach through the process. And to that, simply proceed to season with some salt. And you can also crush in some black peppercorns at this stage. Nice beautiful aroma coming through. And you will of course realize that through the process of making or cooking spinach, it will actually reduce quite drastically in size. Now, just through the process, before you're almost done, proceed to add your chopped chives. You can also incorporate some leeks into this process if you do have some available to you. Also proceed to add a bit of your cumin powder, and also add in a bit of your ginger powder. Now the beautiful thing about adding these ingredients later on in the process is that they don't actually overpower the mixture. Be sure to also make sure that you mix through continuously. This is of course to make sure that you do actually have the same flavors carrying through your mixture through the whole process. And this should of course take you anywhere between 7 to 8 minutes to complete. And as I mentioned, very important that you do not add any particular water at this stage. Saute your spinach and keep it as dry as possible. And of course you can always drizzle just a little bit of your oil towards the very end. This will also make sure that your spinach is of course beautifully flavored. It also gives it a nice beautiful shine. And it will of course also aid in keeping your spinach nice and moist, making sure that your filling is not of course too dry. Right, and once that's done, proceed to turn off your heat completely. And we're going to pretty much cool that off in a separate bowl. Remember, moving it from your pot to a bowl will aid in making sure that it actually cools off very, very quickly. Right, simple as that. Your first process is complete. Now we're going to be also making the sauce at this stage. Remember, very importantly, always have your sauce ready before your ravioli goes into the oil, so that as soon as it actually comes from the water, it can actually go straight into your sauce and you can complete the process. So we're going to allow this to sit undisturbed right behind us, giving it quite enough time to cool off. And remember, you can actually be able to saute your filling or mix your filling way in advance. You can actually chill that in your refrigerator and proceed to assemble your ravioli towards very, very closely towards the process, towards the time that you'll be serving your dish. So this can actually be made way in advance. You can actually store it and freeze it, and you can actually even portion it, making it much easier for you to make your ravioli a little faster in days to come. Now we're going to begin the second process of making our coconut sauce. So I'm going to just switch on to a clean pan, and I'll begin by turning on the gas. Right, now to make your sauce, very, very simple. You're going to require some tomatoes, some onions. We're also going to be incorporating a bit of our coriander, our lemon, our ginger powder, and our cumin powder. I'm also going to mention, also have an egg handy for this process. You will of course need it a little later when assembling your ravioli. And of course, for those of you who may not, if you just joined in, very important that I also recap on the coconut milk. Now this is basically going to be the base for our sauce. So be sure to have just enough to be able to actually make, you should actually have enough of it just to be able to make sure that you have enough sauce for your ravioli at the end of the process. Now onto the clean pan, proceed by adding some oil and proceed to add your white onions. Now this we're going to be cooking at medium to low heat. This is of course to make sure that our onions are completely softened and sweated out. So proceed to mix that through, making sure of course to also have quite enough oil in your pan. So proceed to saute your onions giving them just enough time to sweat out completely and allow for them to tenderize as they continue. And to that, we'll proceed to add the remaining bit of our ginger powder and our cumin powder. You can also proceed to begin chopping your coriander at this stage. So using a sharp knife, begin by trimming off the stem end or the root end of your coriander stems, and proceed to chop up your leaves very, very finely by, of course, beginning by assembling them on a surface or on your chopping board. And using your sharp knife, proceed to chop that as finely as you possibly can. Remember, the sharper the knife, the easier the process. So this should actually give you about 3 to 4 tablespoons of your freshly chopped coriander leaves. Be sure to make sure as well not to have any stems in there through the process. Now, of course, your onions at this stage will begin to color, and as soon as you can see those small hints of the brown, proceed to add your tomatoes. Now this, as I mentioned, have been seeded and of course chopped up into some small cubes. Now proceed to cook that at medium to low heat. And at this stage, proceed to add just a little bit of some room temperature water. This will also aid in breaking up your tomatoes, and of course also aids in cooling down your pan slightly. And it also gives you quite an advantage in allowing you to dissolve your cumin powder and your ginger powder. So proceed to mix that through. Okay, now this is going to pretty much continue to cook. We will allow for the liquid to continue to evaporate, while of course giving our tomatoes and onions quite a bit of time to continue to break down. But of course, begin by or finish by adding your coriander at this stage. Mixing through with your spoon, making sure to incorporate and give a nice beautiful consistency to your mixture. It will of course give also a very, very beautiful color and aroma at this stage. Now we're going to continue to saute that for anywhere between 4 to 5 more minutes. Mixing continuously, of course, allows for you to get a more even, consistent breaking down of your tomatoes. Also allows for you to make sure that you actually have a bit of a chance to also evaporate the water a little quicker. Also a very, very important advantage when using a nice big pan. This will of course aid in evaporating your liquid a little faster. And of course by this stage, if your tomatoes are not of course fully broken down, you can proceed to add a little bit more water. And remember, this also aids in making sure that you actually keep your pan nice and cool through the process. and that your filling or your ingredients do not dry up too quickly. Right, once that's done, we're going to proceed to add our second last and final ingredient. So I'm going to begin by slicing my lemon into half. Now remember, very, very importantly, that when you incorporate your lemon juice, make sure that you don't actually have any seeds inside it. So be sure to grab a small sieve or any particular sieve available to you. And while holding the sieve right over your pan, squeeze out the juice of your lemon. And now the beautiful thing about using these yellow potted lemons is they're actually a little sweeter to the taste, and they actually are not going to make the mixture very, very zesty. They also give a very, very good appeal to the flavor, and it actually brings the flavors of the rest of your ingredients to a very, very beautiful level of taste. And of course, right towards the end of the process, proceed to incorporate your coconut milk. And very, very importantly, as most of us always are tempted to actually pour this out in the sink, you can actually rinse the same glass that you had your coconut milk by adding a little bit of water, and by swirling it very, very gently, you will of course be able to get every bit of your coconut milk out of your cup or your glass, and proceed to add that to your mixture. And mix that very, very briefly. And at this stage, you can of course proceed to make sure that your mixture continues to cook at very, very low heat. But do remember that you are going to be adding some ravioli to this. So my particular secret to getting your sauce right every single time is by reheating it twice. So I'm going to turn off the sauce at this stage and allow it to cool off. I am of course going to turn the heat on a little later on when the ravioli is already in the water. And this is basically going to allow for the flavors to continue to marinate in there, making sure that you get a very, very beautiful consistency and flavor in your mixture. And you can of course season very, very lightly with a bit of salt and some black peppercorns. And now you can actually allow your sauce to sit on the side undisturbed, giving you a bit of more room to begin to heat up your water for your ravioli. But I am of course going to take a very, very quick break just to reassemble my station. But when I do come back, I will of course take you through the process of assembling your ravioli, and I'll take you through the last and final step of incorporating your ravioli into your coconut cream mixture. So please don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. So I'm going to begin very, very simply by scooping 1 heaped teaspoon of my spinach mixture onto each sheet, making sure to set that right at the very center. We'll of course begin to remove them once more, removing one piece at a time. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. If you're just tuning into the show today, we've pretty much finished making our filling for our ravioli, and we also managed to begin the sauce. Now we're pretty much left with just the ravioli, and as I mentioned, always save this for last because this is pretty much the longest and hardest stretch. But of course, once you have your filling and your sauce ready, it makes it so much easier for you to work right through to the very finish. Now to begin the process, very important that you have some egg wash ready. So into a bowl, proceed to crack one whole egg and whip that very lightly just to break the yolk. Also have a brush ready and a knife or a pizza cutter if you do have one available to use. This is of course just to aid you in trimming down your ravioli sheets or your wonton sheets. And of course the egg wash will pretty much work as your binding agent. So this is basically going to allow for you to make sure that your sheets do stick together before they actually proceed to go into the hot water. Right, so once your egg wash is done, you can actually just set that somewhere close by. Make some space to work, of course, and onto your working surface, begin by dusting with some flour. Remember, very important that when you're working with dough, that you actually have a bit of flour on your hands. This, of course, makes it so much easier to be able to handle your dough. And begin the process by laying your sheets of your wonton paper right over your surface, making sure to detach them very, very gently. So proceed to lay those out. Remember, this is pretty much the bottom end of your ravioli sheet. So this is pretty much where your filling is going to be sitting on before you proceed to cover it up. And also be sure to always take time and make sure that you don't actually have two sheets stuck together, because this could actually make your ravioli very, very chewy and of course very, very hard to cook through. So proceed to lay down your sheets as you did from the beginning. And of course, be sure to also make sure that before you begin the process, that your mixture or your filling is actually cooled off completely. You can actually also proceed to lay out the pieces of sheets that you're going to be using to cover the top with. Of course, this always makes it much easier for you to work without stopping or without any interruptions. And it also aids as well in making sure that you don't also have your sheets stuck together, making it quite hard for you to stop and separate them in between the process. And also very important to make sure that you have equal number. Remember, each sheet that you have set aside will of course go right over each of the ones you laid out. So be sure to always keep count and make sure that they're actually okay. Perfect. So this is actually ready to go. Now all you need to do now is proceed to move your filling onto your wonton sheets. So I'm going to begin very, very simply by scooping 1 heaped teaspoon of my spinach mixture onto each sheet, making sure to set that right at the very center. And proceed to do the same right up until when you get to the very last piece. Now, as I mentioned, very, very important to also allow for your filling to always cool off completely. Remember, any bit of heat that can come into contact with your dough will actually make the dough very, very wet. And this will, of course, make it very, very hard for you to handle your dough through the process of assembling your ravioli. And also be sure to also use a spoon for this process. Remember, this may of course look very simple to the eye, but it is of course the one basic tool that you can be able to use to make sure that you have equal amounts of filling on each particular sheet. And proceed to fill up right up until you get to the last and final one. And once that is done, be sure to just go through the sheets maybe with your naked eye, Be sure to make sure that you have at least enough filling on each particular sheet and that each of them actually has the same amount. And now all that's left to do is begin by egg washing each of your sheets. Of course, beginning with the one that you started with. Always important that you follow that sequence. Remember, by beginning at the one that you finished off with will of course give the one that you began with quite a bit of time for your spinach to make the wonton sheets too moist. So be sure to follow the same procedure of assembly right from the beginning to the very end. Now also be sure to give a very, very thin coating of your egg wash. Remember, too much egg will of course also make it very hard for you to handle your sheets. And of course, by the use of a brush, it makes it so much easier for you to make sure that you have just enough of your egg wash on each sheet. And also, very important, make sure that you also have a pot of water already on the go, so that once you're done assembling your sheets, all you need to do is throw them straight into some boiling water and they can actually begin the first process of the pre-cooking stage. Right, so once you've egg washed each sheet, you can actually set aside your egg wash. And all you need to do now is begin assembling each of your sheets by, of course, moving the sheets that you had set aside onto each one, making sure that all four corners touch. And be sure to also give it a very, very gentle squeeze to make sure that you don't actually have any air pockets in there. And proceed to do the same thing until you get to the very last piece. So of course, a very, very simple way of making sure that you don't have any air pockets inside there is always by making sure that you start by pressing from one end, pressing towards the very corner of the other end. And this will of course make sure that you actually squeeze out any air that may actually be trapped in there. Because if you don't do so, this is actually going to break as soon as it gets into your water bath. And this is something you don't want to encounter. So very important to also inform you, you can actually also make your ravioli in advance and freeze the sheets or freeze your ravioli. And pretty much all you need to do before the time of service is pretty much allow for your water to come to the boil, blanch them for about 2 to 3 minutes. Of course, making sure that your water is already boiling before you do so. Otherwise, your sheets will actually begin to absorb the water and they will of course get very, very soggy. Now, as you work your way towards the very end, be sure to make sure that you're also very, very consistent when assembling. Remember, you do also want to make sure that once this gets to your plate, that the pieces actually look almost similar to each other and that they are also sizable and very, very similar in shape and in size. Right, now for the last and final 2 pieces. Now just to finish that last one off. Right, once done, dust your hands very, very lightly and proceed to go around each piece, making sure that your filling is nicely positioned at the center and that you still don't have any air bubbles trapped in there. And that your sheets are also pretty much attached on each side. This is of course to aid in making sure they don't also pop open as soon as they get into the water. Proceed to do so, making sure to give a nice thorough check to each piece. Remember, you never want to actually go through the process of preparing your ravioli and having to lose out on one or two pieces because of Right, so once that's done, very simply, you can of course use a fork for this process. I prefer to use a spoon. Proceed to just press around the sides of your filling. And this is of course just to make sure that the two sheets are completely binded together. And proceed to do so for every single piece. And of course, very important, as you proceed to finish off, always make sure to eliminate any bits of fault on your ravioli. Remember, as I mentioned, it would be quite a waste to go through the process and have to begin all over again. And on many occasions, many of us may actually have just enough lasagna sheets or just enough sheets just to assemble your ravioli. And this may of course force you to make some more if you of course didn't leave any that you can actually use for your backup. Right, so once done, we're going to pretty much begin to trim out any excess dough from our sheets. And by the use of a pizza cutter, this should make it very easy for you to get a bit of symmetry onto each piece. And you can proceed to move this onto a plate. Of course, very important to remember to dust before you continue. And of course, very important to mention, be sure not to trim too much. Otherwise, you could actually have your ravioli pieces popping open. So trim only the excess that you may not need. And of course, make sure that at the point that you begin to cut, that you're not actually cutting past the point that you actually had your egg wash binding the sheets together. And just repeat the same thing right up until the very end. Then another thing also, just to remind you, be sure to keep your dough a little dusted through the process. This will of course also aid in making sure that your pieces don't stick together. Right, once you get to the very last piece, all you're left to do is begin to cook your ravioli. So as I mentioned, very important that your pot is already on the go. I will also mention, very importantly, always remember to season your water with a bit of salt. And once done, all you're left to do is begin by dropping your pieces of ravioli into your water And as I mentioned, very important that you actually keep an eye on your pot right through this process, because this can actually overcook very, very easily. So to be on the safe side, you can begin by making half of your batch. And also, very, very important thing to have right at the end of the process, have a sieve or a strainer that you can actually be able to drain your ravioli very, very briefly as soon as it comes out of the water. And one way that you can actually tell that your ravioli is ready to come out is the fact that they actually begin to float as soon as they're ready to come out. So you will actually notice that the pieces, once you throw them into the water, they will sink to the very bottom. And as soon as the sheets start to cook, each of your pieces will begin to float. And all you need to do is remove the floating pieces one at a time and set them very, very gently onto your strainer or onto your sieve. And this will of course allow for any excess water to run off completely. Right, once your first batch is done, all you need to do is proceed to add your second batch. And as I mentioned, very important that you also space them out as soon as you throw them into your water bath. This is of course to allow for each piece to get a nice even distribution of heat. And once done, all you need to do is proceed to clear up your station in the meantime. You can of course discard any bits of dough that are still left over through the process. And very important to mention, if you do actually have a bit of filling left over, remember you can always just put that in a separate container and freeze it. And you can actually be able to reuse the next time you actually have the same recipe or the same ravioli that you'll be preparing. And you can actually defrost and proceed to incorporate into your mixture in the later stage. Now, as our second batch begins to float, we'll of course begin to remove them once more, removing one piece at a time. And also very important to mention, always allow for them to come to the float. Don't be tempted to remove them a little too early, because this will actually get them very, very stuck together, and it may actually be very hard to handle them in the process. Right, just to remove the last and final piece. Right, once that's done, all you need to do is remove your pot of water from the heat. And you can begin to reheat your sauce at this stage, giving you just enough time to allow those to sit on the side and drain. And you can proceed to combine the rest of your dish together. But before we get there, I will of course clean up my station, and when we do come back, I'll take you through the process of adding your ravioli into your sauce and very, very simply getting it onto your plate. So see you in a very little while. So once this is drained completely, I'm just going to proceed to turn those over onto our pot and very, very simply slide them into your sauce. All you need to do is just drizzle just a little bit of olive oil right over the top. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. If you're just tuning in, you've probably missed out on very many things that we've covered on the show today. But remember, you can recap on this and many more by subscribing to our YouTube channel. That's BrandPlus TV Kenya. Right now, as our sauce has already come to the boil, we are left with just one thing, which is of course to add in our ravioli. So once this is drained completely, I'm just going to proceed to turn those over onto our pot and very simply slide them into your sauce, using your spoon of course to break them apart. I always insist, don't try and tear them open by hand. Just slide them into the sauce and the pieces will actually begin to separate on their own. I know on many occasions the ravioli sheets do actually attach to each other and make it very hard for you to separate. But remember, as soon as that hits the sauce, it will actually make it so much easier for you to detach the pieces, making it as well very easy to spread them out, allowing each piece of course to get a bit of the sauce. Right, so pretty much as soon as your sauce is hot enough and each of your pieces is coated in your sauce, all you need to do is proceed to begin your plating. So very simply, onto a pasta plate or any particular plate of your choice, proceed to turn down your heat completely. And all you need to do now is, using a spoon, proceed to first lift your ravioli from your pan onto your plate. Making sure of course to scatter them as you plate. This will of course make it so much easier for you to be able to identify them on the plate. So I'm going to plate about 6 pieces on this plate. Remember also, very importantly, never have too much of one thing on one plate. Right, once that's done, very importantly, always remember to also drizzle a little bit more sauce onto your plate. Remember, being a pasta dish, very important that you have quite enough sauce in there to be able to make it worth the while to enjoy your plate of ravioli. And once done, all you need to do is make sure your plate is nice and clean before serving. And our homemade ravioli is as easy as done. I can also maybe share one more suggestion. If you do have maybe some Parmesan cheese or any particular cheese you prefer, you can actually proceed to scatter that or sprinkle that right over the top, and you can actually garnish your plate in any particular fashion you like. One particular one that I like to use is a bit of some olive oil. So all you need to do is just drizzle just a little bit of olive oil right over the top. And that brings us to the last and final part of the dish for today. I do hope you've had fun today and you're pretty much able to now take a chance and try making your own ravioli from home. But from my end, this is as easy as done. Some serving suggestions I could probably share with you. Remember, the amount of fillings that you can use for ravioli are endless. Be it vegetarian or meat, the option remains with you. Also, something also to mention, you can of course serve that with cheese if you're a big fan, and if you're of course not a big fan of cheese, you can of course proceed to serve that straight onto the table. So I will of course thank you again for tuning in today. I do of course thank you once more for the comments that you've been sending in, but do remember, you can of course also get a chance to be on our show by simply texting the 5-digit code on your screens. Be sure to give us a small description of what you're about, where you're from, and something that you're looking forward to learn on the show, and I'll be more than happy to answer your call. But from my end, thank you once again. Do stay blessed, and until the next episode of Dinner Guide, I'm Chef Andy saying goodbye.